thank you, Henry, and thank you for inviting me to participate in this very interesting and important dialogue. And I'm honored to be a member of this particular panel. We've already heard quite a bit of wisdom from my three colleagues, and I will try to make a modest contribution to that. So what I'd like to do is step back from the breathless statements of doom, which dominate much of the immediate commentary in the media, among politicians, and among so-called experts, or even the thoughtful observations of concern, which may be overly influenced by specific current actions by one party or the other. The US-China relationship is and will be both the most important bilateral relationship of this century and the one which will drive or create in large measure the world in which we all will live. In general, I am skeptical of grand sweeping statements about inflection points or decoupling or Cold War analogies. For me, these kinds of statements are mostly emotional, provocative, not helpful, and wrong. I think we are better off looking at the long term, the trajectory of the dynamics, trends, and forces creating that long term. Recently, I have taken to looking at the mid-21st century, the year 2050 or thereabouts. The best estimates are that the world's population in 2050 will be about 10 billion people. Today, we are approximately 7.8 billion. The incremental 2.2 billion, more than half of them will come from 9 countries: India, Nigeria, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Pakistan, Ethiopia, Tanzania, the United States, Uganda, and Indonesia. In 2050, as now, a small percentage of the world's countries will represent 65 to 70% of the global GDP. Maybe the top 10 countries will represent that. In that world, in which very few countries dominate the global GDP, and in which the incremental 2+ billion people are coming from very poor countries, in that world, does any serious thinking person believe the world would be better off with the rich countries primarily arguing or even fighting amongst themselves, while the rest of the vast percentage of the world remains poor, malnourished, victims of climate change, sources of migration and disease and poverty? Or do the wealthy, most powerful countries have a responsibility to work together to lead the world to a safer, more prosperous, harmonious place? Isn't the answer obvious? If the answer is so obvious, then why does it feel or seem that at least some, maybe many, of the world's richest, most powerful countries do not seem to be animated or motivated by such a collective goal? There are a myriad of answers to this question, but it certainly includes a penchant for being captured or trapped by the past and old thinking, as well as a fear of change, of losing one's place. Whatever the reasons, surely the world's 2 most powerful countries, the US and China, have a disproportionate responsibility to lead the world, of course, with others. And there is no reason why they cannot do this. In fact, we have a unique asset at this very moment in history, which we have never had before, an extraordinarily powerful asset. The newly elected US President, Joe Biden, has a pre-existing relationship with the Chinese President, Xi Jinping. When Presidents Biden and Xi were vice presidents of their countries, they spent extensive, continuous, informal time with one another. Probably more genuine private time than any 2 US and Chinese presidents have ever spent with one another. This is a gift from Providence. We cannot throw this asset away. Indeed, we must use it to its fullest extent. Knowing the two presidents, Biden and Xi, as people, as human beings, as leaders, does anyone think that a well-conceived meeting, one-on-one, between the two of them would be anything other than a strong, good, healthy, warm, productive meeting? And knowing what we know about the two countries and their positions in the world, does anyone think such a good meeting would not be well received by the American and Chinese people or by people all over the world? Of course it would. This is not that difficult. And there is a screamingly obvious place to start. Climate change and the G20 meeting in Glasgow. The issue of climate is a global one. It is larger and more important than the US and China. The entire thinking world wants it to be solved or well managed. The two leading countries must lead on the solution or it will not be solved. Everyone knows this. Tellingly, the two presidents are following the only path, the only modus operandi that works in US-China relations. One might call this the Zhou Enlai Kissinger model, or more recently, the Liu He Lighthizer model. The only model that we know works is when the US and Chinese presidents appoint a very senior, serious, experienced, highly trusted individual, and together the two presidents instruct the two people to get into a metaphysical room, truly work together, build a relationship of trust, and do not come out until they have solved the problem. The two presidents have done just that with the appointments of John Kerry and Xi Jinping. Meanwhile, it would be helpful while the two are doing their work if the two sides moderated their language about all other matters, or as Stape said, toned down the rhetoric. No other matter, by definition, is as important as the existence of the planet. Mankind has to exist for all other matters to have an opportunity to flourish and or be addressed. This is a point of simple, compelling priority. Both presidents have publicly said that they will cooperate on climate irrespective of other issues. Both should instruct their senior leaders to give the existential issue a real chance to get resolved. Finally, to state the obvious, success on climate will demonstrate yet again that the US and China working together can lead the world to a better, safer, healthier, more harmonious existence. This is good for both countries and the world and gives hope and a concrete model that all other gnarly, complex problems can likewise be addressed by the two leading countries working together with others for the collective benefit of their countries, their peoples, and the world. Thank you, Henry.
Thank you very much, John. You have excellent proposal. I think you have really get very deep on that. I agree that you said that this is most important relation between China and US, and of course we can work on many issues. Given the world is really having profound changes now, as you outlined, we're going to have the population hit 10 billion by 2050. We need really a long horizon, looking at the longer views historically. When I had a dialogue with Joseph Nye, he also talked about, by 2035 or even longer, maybe China and US will view each other differently, less hostile than today, because we're having the world in mind. Probably is making a huge difference. Like climate change, we're having this floods in Europe, floods in China, in Henan, and wildfire in North America and things like that. We really need to contain that. And I think the brilliant idea you talk about, since President Biden, President Xi has such a great personal rapport, they really should appoint probably special envoy, and like we solving this dialogue, as you call it, the Kissinger-Zhou Enlai model. I think that is a great model, or Lighthizer-Liu He model. So I agree. That's really great. I may have a follow-up question because since you are in the investment community, you've been leading the Goldman Sachs for so many years. I mean, the world is really need a lot of help. I mean, you said 9 countries that going to be populous in the next several decades. So the infrastructure seems to be the lacking in many other developing countries. As a matter of fact, at today's CCG annual conference, former Vice Minister Chen Jian of the Commerce, he looked after China outbound investment for many years. He actually said, what has been proposed at the G7 about this B3W could be maybe looked at together with China's BRI and other EU investment plan. The world should work together with some kind of infrastructure plan to look at the future, particularly for the developing countries. As a matter of fact, when President Xi had a telephone call, a video conference with President Macron and Angela Merkel, German Chancellor, just 2 or 3 weeks ago, they talk about China-EU collaboration in Africa. So what do you think? We need some things that glue all those countries together to work on a better objective, rather than really obsessed with this source of origin of virus and those non-urgent issues. So what do you think? John, please.
Well, first of all, I want to remind people that the BRI, when it was first conceived back in 2013, there was a G20 meeting, and President Xi met with a very senior American who was standing in for President Obama because President Obama was not present. And in that meeting, President Xi told the Americans of the concept he had about the BRI. And the senior American said to President Xi, what a fantastic idea. Maybe we could do this together. And President Xi said, that would be an excellent idea. Let's do it together. And the senior American went back to the United States. And lo and behold, in the next 6 or 9 months or so, let's call them the Mandarin technicians decided it wasn't a good idea. And the idea got killed in the US before it ever got to President Obama's desk. And so the cooperation never occurred. And since then, as you know, the BRI has been characterized by many people in the United States as some kind of sort of nefarious geostrategic plan to take over the world, which it never was conceived as and is not. Now, to your direct question, of course the Build Back Better and the BRI, all those efforts should be coordinated globally by the wealthy countries trying to build the infrastructure necessary for the rest of the world so that we build a safer, more prosperous world. And we all know these kinds of projects are very difficult to execute. It's not as though anyone's got a monopoly on how to do this well. They're hard. And we'd be doing ourselves a great service if we the world, became particularly expert at building important infrastructure all over the world in an efficient manner for the benefit of the respective countries in the world. So yeah, it's perfectly obvious that we should be doing. There's no question about that.
Thank you. Yeah, great. Actually, I heard the same story last year in February at the Munich Security Conference. CCG hosted a roundtable. We had the former Secretary of State John Kerry as a speaker there, and he actually mentioned that when he met President Xi, he was inviting China to join the Paris Accord, and President Xi also mentioned that invited the U.S. to join Belt and Road. I mean, at that time, John told me that it was really a positive concern, but as you said, the Mandarin somehow lost that in the system that that never materialized. But I think it's time that for the next several decades, maybe China, US, EU, and Japan, and all those countries can work together for the infrastructure revolution that is really transformed China, for example. And also China has built this AIB, and also US was invited, somehow was lost it. Now the AIB has 104 country members, including all the European countries almost, and just excluding Japan and the US. So I hope that maybe we could upgrade AIB to GIB, to Global Infrastructure Investment Bank, and let US, China, and the EU work together on that. So thank you for your open mind on that. So we had the first round, and now I want to come back to other distinguished panelists. I mean, Adam, I know Peterson Institute has been studying TPP for so many years. You were proposing a lot very well. And so TPP in China, when President Trump withdrew from TPP, CCG is the first think tank in China, proposed that China should join TPP. We actually issued several reports on that. We've been constantly advocate for that. And finally, Premier Li mentioned that last year at the National People's Congress, China is interested. President Xi announced that at the APEC, that China is interested in joining the TPP. And Minister of Commerce now put the TPP agreements on the Minister of Commerce website to show that here are the standards, on all those issues. So since Peterson is a great think tank on the economic issues, particularly you've been studying this TPP for many years. I know that you have many scholars doing that. So what's your take on those issues? If we can talk, under some kind of issues, because TPP involves, data flow, like what Minister Zhu said, used to be an obstacle, and also IPR protection, environment protection, labor standards, or SOE reform, competitive neutrality. Maybe, we could talk about that. Like John said, we should have two sides talk about that. And the US designed the TPP, and why not US come back to TPP and China comes together, and let's talk about all those urgent issues so that we can have push the reform of the WTO, by those regional integration experiment that we already have on the RCEP, on the TPP, and others as well. So Adam, your take, please.
Thank you, Henry. So let me pick up on what you were just saying and what my friend Wang Huiyao, Minister Zhu, was saying about reform. The most important thing about CPTPP, especially as it has evolved since President Trump withdrew, is that it is an incredibly high standard agreement, and it is an incredibly open agreement. In other words, when Peterson Institute, as you say, has been proudly doing work on economic agreements on free trade areas, particularly in Asia, for decades. And long ago, there was a debate between my predecessor, Fred Bergston, and the distinguished Columbia economist, Jagdish Bhagwati, about trade blocks, stumbling blocks versus building blocks. And the basic message that we took, that I've altered slightly, is that you can have regional agreements be useful if they genuinely open things up and if they genuinely encourage reform and high standards in the countries that are members. And if you are not biasing them by political factors. And so I'm going to go out on a bit of an unusual limb here and say, for the time being, it would be good if CPTPP continues to succeed and grow without either China or the US being involved. I think in the current context where a number of people in both Chinese and American governments are looking to line up various developing countries around the world, including but not solely in East and South Asia, as being on one side or the other. And this relates to what Professor Thornton was saying about the Belt and Road Initiative and how that goes. I think it was very good to have a live, high standard, open entity that is neither Chinese nor the US, and that offers a way forward without asking people to commit to one side or another in some sense. And we can see this in the extension of CPTPP potentially to the UK and to Korea. In both cases, this would send an important message to the rest of the world that you can have high standard commerce on the issues you raised, including labor rights, environmental standards, data privacy, state subsidies, and so on. All the things that the Obama administration and former USTR Mike Froman, but also importantly, the Japanese, Singaporean, Australian, New Zealand governments argued for. And have that be a standard that then puts pressure on both the US and China to raise their own games. And this, I think, it goes with something I wrote, I guess almost a year ago now, where I encouraged the Australians and the Japanese to pursue what I call principled plurilateralism. That is, that they should be willing to engage in these plurilateral deals, but they have to be based on quality and standards. And I think this will disappoint some people in both Beijing and Washington, particularly in Washington, where the arguments for CPTPP initially and the claims to bring it back to Washington are all about aligning the trading system against China, or having a bloc that puts pressure on China, but pressure on China by exclusion. I also think that it's preferable to go this route by having a independent, strong CPTPP that's not dominated by China or US, because frankly, we know that once trade agreements are made, you have issues of enforcement. And China and the US would probably make as conditions of their accession changes to the TPP or changes to enforcement. It will not be entirely reliable. We've seen this in the way the US has repeatedly renegotiated USMCA and Korea-US trade agreement. We've seen this in other ways in China's deals. And whereas if we keep it open to everyone but China and the US without saying so, CPTPP is big enough that anybody who accedes, including say Korea or the UK, would have to accede, would have to be an accession country. Now, my friend Wang Huiyao mentions the importance of multilateral institutions, and obviously the WTO is lurking in the background here. I think there are completely ways of keeping this compatible with the WTO, but the kind of plurilateral deals of the willing are necessary to keep moving reform forward. We cannot have India and Brazil, blocking all progress on trade. The final point, sorry, I should put in one footnote and one final point. Thank you for your indulgence. The footnote is, this is my own view. We are a center of work on CPTPP and on trade integration in Asia. My colleague Jeff Schott recently wrote telling Japan that they need to get the US back into CPTPP. So this is not a Peterson Institute position. This is my own. Close footnote. The final point I would make is, in light of Wang Huiyao's rightly raising and State and everybody rightly raising that the pandemic response is far more important than the other things that we talked about. And I chose not to talk about that because, Henry, I was trying to be responsive directly to your question. And I don't want to give the impression I've changed my mind since Mr. Zhu and I spoke a year and a half ago. This is still the critical thing. But what that means is, as seen in the latest IMF release, which came out, I think, overnight, that the world is incredibly divided, with the poor countries being excluded from vaccine distribution and likely to have very long-lasting suffering economically and socially. As you said, I think, or it was you or John said rightly, this isn't just about public health. This has implications that are much more long-lasting. I think a China and or US included CPTPP would reinforce the message that the rich countries or the countries already integrated can get on with their business and ignore what happens in the rest of the world. And that message is already coming through much too strongly on the vaccination and aid front. And so at this time, I would much rather see China and the US put their efforts into being helpful there than into CPTPP. I want Japan, Australia, Singapore, Canada, all the members of CPTPP to move forward, but not China, US.
Good. So which I think you mean that let CPP run for a while. I mean, let us really experiment out that. But what about the WTO? I mean, that the minister meeting of WTO is coming up this year. And we have already the new DJ being approved by the US is running office already quite a few months. So what do you think of the prospect of a WTO reform? We have those polylateral meetings on digital economy, on trade liberation and the facilitations and investment facilitation as well. And so what about that? It seems that now quickly G7, US and OECD proposed this corporate minimum tax internationally. China joined that. 130 countries agree with that. So anything we can really, talk on each other and agree on, and G20 can really, turn efforts to fighting pandemic. Also addressing those economic issues.
Yeah, so just quickly, I think on the WTO, as again, with so many things, the rhetoric has outstripped the reality. All the talk about WTO reform and WTO dysfunction, especially in Washington, is exaggerated and unjustified. I think the frustrations with the trade rounds, the large-scale trade rounds, are real, and there are some tweaks to be had to the appellate body. But the new Director General, Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, who I admire greatly, I think has come in with the right attitude, which is don't try to fix everything at once. Don't get caught up in procedures. Try to get deliverables. Show the world that the WTO can deliver things that matter to people. And so she is rightly focusing on trade issues having to deal with the pandemic, with fisheries, with direct, limited appellate body reforms. I think this is the right way to go. There are too many things. You just rattled off a huge list, Henry. There are too many things to be done. What's important is that the WTO leadership gets the membership in time for the end of this year's ministerial to make meaningful progress on 2 or 3 of these issues, one of which is pandemic. And otherwise, it doesn't matter which of the issues. You just need to demonstrate that the WTO can do something useful. And I think if we go off onto too many directions at once, it's not going to be helpful. Mm-hmm. I'm sorry, you'd raised a second point. I'm happy to yield my time to others, but you had raised a second point. I'm sorry. What was
the minimum corporate tax?
Minimum corporate tax. Yeah, no, it was a wonderful thing to see China as well as other major economies agree on this. I think it is critically important for the legitimacy of taxation in all societies, as well as providing revenues on a stable basis for all societies, that we get the international corporations, notably but not solely the US digital giants, under this regime and not having base erosion and profit shifting. And again, Minister Zhu was involved in the first rounds of those discussions, and I praise him and I praise Secretary Yellen for leading this. My fear, speaking frankly, is that this may be a League of Nations repeat moment. John warned us against excessive analogies, so I hope he'll forgive me, but that you have a progressive Democrat, in this case, American leadership that gets agreement on something at the global level, comes back and finds a isolationist Republican US Senate prevents it from being enacted. And then the world has to go forward somehow without the US participating. And this, I think, could be disastrous if the US Congress does not take up what the US Treasury Secretary rightly negotiated on behalf of the US and the world. The second point is that it's not perfect. Going back to the themes we've all hit, this was an OECD agreement because that's where the multinationals are and that's where the expertise was, and it makes sense. But as my colleagues Gary Huffbauer and Simeon Junkov have written for the Institute, Peterson Institute, there are a lot of small countries in the world that are not purely tax havens, that are not Ireland or the Netherlands, that are going to be affected by this in the developing world. And again, it's wonderful to see China and U.S. willing to cooperate on something substantive, but there has to be some engagement of the needs of developing countries and small countries. Again, not the tax havens that have made billions over the years, but other countries. So it's not a done deal. But my biggest fear, as I said, is the U.S. creating a not as important as the League of Nations, but another League of Nations moment of doing the right thing internationally and failing to deliver domestically to keep up with it.
Great, thank you, Adam, for your very explanatory answers. And that's good to understand on both sides. But particularly, I think this at least the G20 proposal, China is accepting that, is going along with that. That is really, I think, a good sign that if we do sit down and really analyze this international global economic situation, we can collaborate on that. Now, for Ambassador Rowe, I mean, you've been seasoned diplomat for a long time. You were in China for so many years, even during your childhood time. And I still vividly remember a few years back, we were together, went to Dunhuang and visit the China, and then we went to U.S. Your company has visited in Seattle, so it was really good. Many hearing of your good wisdom. What I would like to ask is that U.S. and China, of course, after 4 decades of engagement. I mean, there's a theory now in the U.S. saying, okay, China, it doesn't converge with us. It didn't become one of us. But you see, China has a 5,000 years history. You probably know very well. And then its civilization, not really interrupted that often. And so China really worked on its own model. I attended the previous ambassador of U.S., Terry Branstad, farewell reception, and he actually said at that conference, at the reception, said the success of China basically he attributes to 3 factors. First is hardworking diligence. He felt that people are still working very hard here. Second is the education. Chinese family attaches great importance to the education. And thirdly, he was talking about is the family value. China really respect seniors, respect authorities. And that's how the Chinese system went. So, I mean, you see, the China has its own unique system, and fighting virus, that system seems to have some advantage. It doesn't have to be exactly with the U.S. Converge. If China can lift 800 million people out of poverty, if China can contribute over 1/3 of global GDP growth, the region, as time goes on, I mean, we don't have to get into Hihidi's trap, like I'm talking to Graham Allison, that he doesn't agree with that as well. I mean, Joseph and I even said, we should have a longer horizon, maybe look in 2035 during one of our conversations. So what do you think, given your lifetime experience on China, what's your take on the future development between China and the U.S.? I mean, from a former American ambassador to China and a former China hand, of course, still a China hand, very high China hand. So, Ambassador, your take again, please.